Hi there, everybody. This is Gaston with Headwire.com. Today we're releasing AEM Solr Search 2.0, and we want to go over some of the new features. So let's head on over to GitHub. And before we get started, we've made a couple of changes outside of the code base. Namely, we've transitioned all of the documentation off of aemsolrsearch.com and into the GitHub wiki. So this is where you can find more detail about the project, including reference architectures, release notes, etc. Okay, so let's talk a bit about some of the new features in 2.0. So to start, we upgraded the SolrJ OSGI bundle to a fairly recent version of Solr 5.x, namely 5.4.1. We've also deprecated support for older versions of AEM, so with this version we're targeting 6.1 and above. The primary motivation for moving to a 2.0 release was to support all of the modes that Solr supports. So the first one that we're supporting now is SolrCloud. This is the distributed mode of Solr. We also support standalone. This is the mode that we've supported in earlier versions. And then we've also added support for the legacy clustering solution, basically the master-slave model. On the reference site, we moved away from modeling our Solr documents within AEM as adapters, and we've moved over to Sling models. Also, the previous version of AEM Solr Search, all the components were targeted to the old classic UI using the XJS dialogues. For this release, we have updated all the components to also support the touch UI. We made a couple of improvements to our quick start distribution of Solr. This is to allow for kind of an easy setup of Solr with our reference implementation. Unfortunately, Solr has deprecated the Solr war file in Solr 5. So if you want to use the old quick start distribution from our Maven project, that'll only work up to Solr 4. But what we've done for Solr 5 is we've introduced another submodule that will actually use Vagrant and VirtualBox to host Solr for us. And we'll get into a bit on that subject in our demo. Okay, so to get things started, let's start with deploying AEM Solr Search from scratch. I'm back on GitHub, and we're going to take a look at the README and go through the Getting Started section. So in this section, we're going to deploy AEM Solr Search and the old standalone Solr 4.x distribution. So let's get started. So I'm currently in the main project workspace, the root of the project, and the first thing we need to do is deploy the AEM Solr Search application, basically the framework to AEM. So I'll let that run in the background. Okay, so now that that's deployed, the next thing we need to deploy is our reference implementation. And this really hasn't changed. Basically what we've done is we provided a demonstration of how you can model Solr documents and index Solr with AEM Solr Search. In this case, this project is basically building on top of the Geometrics media site. Specifically, it's indexing articles. So this project contains the Sling models that will represent an article in the Solr index. It has the event listener and indexing code to index those models. And then we also provide some sample servlets and shell scripts to do basically full index loads. And then the last portion of the AEM integration is to deploy the content site. And all this is basically a small sample site with one search page that will actually allow us to search against the geometrics media site, specifically the articles. Okay, so we'll let that run for a bit more, and it looks like it's finished. So again, the next thing we need to do is set up Solr. We're using our legacy quick start distribution, which will run Solr 4.x. And what's nice about this project is that it actually allows you to fully provision a local running version of Solr 4. It will go and fetch Solr 4 from Maven Central, and it'll embed it in a Jetty container and basically allow you to version your Solr code or Solr home changes and just easily push those out. Okay, so let's take a quick look at how we can index Solr 4 now. And again, none of this has changed. This was all available in the 1.0.4 release. Okay, so we'll open a new tab. And we're going to go into the Geometrics Media Sample submodule. And in this directory, we have a sample indexing script to do a full index. Okay, so at this point, it's gone through and indexed all of the Geometrics Media articles. So at this point, we can take a look at our AEM Solr Search sample site. We can apply some facets here, but fairly easy to set up. Okay. Okay, so now that that's up and running, let's talk about Solr 5 and specifically the SolrCloud support. So to do this, you have to go through and essentially run the first 3 steps above, and this is to deploy AEM Solr Search and the 2 reference bundles. Then we've provided a new submodule that will basically allow us to use Vagrant. So let's jump over to the Vagrant submodule and take a look at its README file. Okay, so for those who aren't familiar, all Vagrant is a provisioning software for virtualization solutions. In our case, we've opted to use VirtualBox as our virtualization technology. So to get started, you will need to download VirtualBox first, and then Vagrant. I've already done that in my local environment, so we're not going to go through that. It should take you about 10 to 15 minutes depending on your system. So to get our Solr 5 image provisioned with Vagrant, all we have to do is move into the Vagrant subdirectory and run Vagrant up. So let's do that right now. So we need to get back into the project root, and then we'll go into the Vagrant project and then type Vagrant up. So for those of you who are not familiar, essentially what this is doing is invoking a provisioning script that we wrote. It's a shell script that will fully build from scratch a working version of Solr 5 in cloud mode with multiple nodes. So the first thing it does is it actually attempts to download a CentOS 7 image. So this is the closest image that resembles what you'd normally find in an enterprise, namely like a Red Hat enterprise version of Linux. So this will take a little bit of time the first time because it does need to fetch the CentOS 7 image. But then after this, it'll go through the rest of our provisioning scripts. So the first thing it does is actually copy over our shell scripts onto the VM, and then it'll start with basically fetching the latest version of Solr 5 from the Apache mirror. It'll unpack that, and then it'll go through the installation process. So this is going to take a little bit of time, so at this moment I'm going to stop the demo and then we'll go back and revisit some of the major pieces that the Vagrant provisioning went through. Okay, so that process took about 5 minutes in my local environment. What I'd like to do is actually scroll up to some of the console outputs so we can walk through some of the things that the provisioning process did for us. Okay, so the first thing you can see in this output in red is that the script went out and it attempted to fetch the Solr 5 distribution from one of the Apache mirrors. And all it does is store that compressed tarball on the file system. Once that was completed, you'll notice that there are a number of packages that are installed, namely JDK8 and a few other dependencies. All we're doing here is essentially using Yum, the package manager that's available with CentOS, to install some of those dependencies. So this is pretty much standard Unix fare. So again, you can see all the packages that Yum has installed for us. Okay, and then once the installation of those OS level packages are installed, our scripts are doing a few things. So one, it's unpacking the Solr distribution that we fetched. It's going in and creating a dedicated Solr system user. It creates a System 5 shell script so that we can start and stop Solr. It also sets up some basic environment settings for our installation. And then it'll go through and actually start Solr. In our case, since this module is designed, or this Vagrant file is designed to deploy a multi-node SolrCloud cluster, you can actually see that it's started Solr node 1 and then a second Solr server right below it. Further down, since this is a SolrCloud deployment with Zookeeper running, it'll actually go through and issue some HTTP requests using curl to do things like create our collection, and then also deploy the configuration sets. The last thing to note is for SolrCloud to work with Vagrant, you do need to add these two host entries at the bottom locally, Solr node 1 and Solr node 2. I'm not going to show you my host file, just take my word for it that for this integration to work, you need to add these two entries. And they're also documented here in the README. All right, so at this point, we can take a look at our first Solr node in our cluster. And we can inspect cloud, and you'll notice that we have one collection with 2 shards, and we have both our servers listed here. Okay. Looks like I lost my GitHub page, so we'll just go back to GitHub. Okay, so now that we've deployed Vagrant and have SolrCloud running, we need to tell AEM Solr Search that we want to cut away from the standalone version and move over to SolrCloud. So to do that, the very first thing we need to do is go to the Felix console in AEM, and we'll do a browser search for AEM Solr, and we need to edit the Solr configuration service. For the most part, a lot of the settings have remained the same from the previous versions. The major difference is you'll notice now there is this new Solr mode, and you have 2 options, standalone or cloud. So let's select SolrCloud. Currently there is one small bug where when you're using the Ajax proxy, we don't automatically detect which active nodes are in Zookeeper. So for right now, the workaround is even though you're in SolrCloud under the master server, just list one of the 2 nodes. So in our case, it was on 89, 83. It was this guy right here. We could have just as easily also added the one that's running on port 7574. It really doesn't matter. Okay, now that we have that configured, we can switch over to our search page. And you notice that there are no results this time. And the reason for that is that we just cut over from the Solr standalone 4.x version that was listening on port 8888, and now we're running in the SolrCloud mode. And if we take a look at collection 1, you'll notice that there are no documents when we execute a query. So it's fairly easy to index SolrCloud so that when we go back to the search page, we can get results. So I'm back in the workspace, and we're going to go into AEM Solr Search, Geometrics, Media Sample. And there is a new shell script called articles-solrcloud.sh, and we'll go ahead and index that. Okay, so now if I go and refresh this page, we get the same results as before. The only difference, it's going against SolrCloud. And if you go back to one of our first node and we execute actually take a look at the shards, you'll notice that the second shard only has 9 documents and the first shard has 8. So that's a good indication that everything's being routed correctly and that we're roughly splitting our index into 2 shards. But when we execute our query, we actually get all 17 results back, as we do in the search interface. Okay, so now that we've showed you how to cut away from standalone to SolrCloud or vice versa, let's take a look at some of the enhancements we made, specifically the Touch UI support. So to do that, let's go over to the projects interface and navigate to our site. So earlier we deployed the geometric sample media content site. So let's click through and let's take a look at the search page in the Touch UI mode. Okay. So at this point I'm going to edit the search controller just to demonstrate that we now support the Touch UI dialogues. So nothing has changed. All of the tabs and all of the features that are available still in Classic UI are here as well. So for example, under the General tab now, it'll auto-discover any collections you have. If you're in SolrCloud, if you're in Solr standalone mode, it'll find all the cores. But everything else has remained the same. It's just really supporting the Touch UI interface. So that concludes our demo. I really hope you guys enjoy it, and we'll take a look at the 2.0 version. Stay tuned for more updates. Bye guys, thank you.